Hello everybody and welcome to another paint kit tutorial. Today we'll be learning all about watercolor florals. If you're joining today because you purchased the date night paint kit, first of all, thank you. We're going to be using all of the supplies included in that kit. And if you haven't purchased the kit, not to worry, you can follow along at home with whatever watercolor supplies you have. These kits are available for purchase on my website at littlerosetta.com. If you're interested, I will link that down below in the description for you. Okay, so let's jump in. First, you'll need to gather your supplies so everything is on hand as we go. So you're going to need a brush. So we're using a number 6 round brush, as you can see. You're going to need your palette, some watercolor paper. So we're just using some 5x7 Canson 140 pound paper. And you're going to need your paints. So today we're using Winsor Newton, the Cotman series. We're using Permanent Rose, Dioxazine Purple, and Hooker's Green. And then you'll also want a spare piece of paper just to use as your test strip. So you can practice on that and you can test out your colors. You're also going to need 2 cups of clean water. So you can use just 1, but I always like to recommend using 2. So your first cup here is going to be your dirty water, and then the second is going to be your clean water. So anytime you have paint on your brush and you want to go and grab more paint or a fresh color, make sure you're cleaning off your brush in the dirty water cup first and then drying it off, and then you can dip back into your clean water to pick up fresh water. And that just helps prevent any unwanted color mixing or any muddiness of your colors. It just helps give you control of the colors that you're picking up and laying down. So you're also going to need, on that note, either a piece of paper towel or a cloth or an old t-shirt or something that you don't mind getting paint on. So I like to use just a cloth, but use whatever you have on hand. So once you have everything all set up, we can get started painting. Okay, so if you're working with pan colors or dots like we have in the kit, any kind of dry watercolor, you're going to first need to activate it. So all you have to do is add a drop or 2 of clean water to each paint, and you'll see that it will immediately start to kind of liquefy. You'll see it start to change consistency there. If you're, again, working from the paint kit, you might find that your brush has a like an adhesive on the tip that's just put there by the manufacturers to keep its shape and to keep that tip protected. So you might just need to clean it off in your water and just kind of scrub it off a little bit just to get that adhesive off. But don't worry, it is water soluble. So it'll come right off. You might just need to give it a few tries. Okay, so a few things before we jump right into the painting. I just want to talk a little bit about watercolor properties. This type of paint, unlike others, relies heavily on your control of water to pigment ratio. So we're using the white of the paper as our white. You'll notice that we don't have a white watercolor. That's because watercolors tend to be very transparent. So you're relying on, again, your ratio of water to pigment to determine sort of how much color you have in your paint. So the more water you use, the more lighter your pigment is going to be, and vice versa. So the thicker your mix, the more concentrated that color is going to be. So it might take a little bit of practice to get used to figuring out those sort of consistencies, but again, that's why we have the test sheet here. So if you're finding that you're wanting to lighten up your pigment, just add a little bit more water. If you're finding that it's not pigmented enough, then you might just need to go back in to your paint and just add a little bit more to your palette there. So just, again, just play around with it. It takes a little bit of practice. And also keep in mind that your brush, it's designed to hold water. So especially with this style of brush, you're gonna get a lot of water in the belly where it's thickest. So anytime that you want to go and pick up a color, but you don't wanna add more water, you don't wanna lighten it, make sure you're cleaning off your brush on your paper towel or whatever before picking up that color. Otherwise, you're just going to deposit more water into that pigment and end up watering it down more than you maybe want to. Okay, so whenever I'm working with new paints or a new palette and I want to, maybe I'm unfamiliar with them or I want to come up with a pleasing range of colors, I always like to swatch out my colors first. So this is very easy. All you're going to do is take some of that pigment just as it is, so you want it to be fairly thick, and then swatch it down on your paper and kind of pull it out so that you're kind of lightening it as you go to the side. You can also take some clean water and add it to the other side of your pigment and then kind of draw it into where your pigment is, and you'll find that it kind of will mix on your paper. And that just helps give you an idea of how the color both reacts with the paper and how it looks when it's more watered down versus more concentrated here. So I'm just going to do that with all of the colors we have here. And then we're going to try creating a few different mixes with these colors. You'll also notice that as your paint dries, it will lighten as it dries. So watercolor is notorious for this. So anytime you think that you've laid down a color that's maybe too dark, give it a minute because it will lighten up a bit as it dries. Okay, so now I'm going to create some mixes with each of these colors. So I'm just going to take some of this pink here, apply that to my palette, and then clean off my brush using some clean water. I'm going to pick up some of that purple. And this is going to create kind of an in-between shade of these two. And you can vary the shade so it's more purple or more pink just by varying those ratios. So you can see there how that's kind of an in-between of those two. And then I'm going to do the same with the purple and the green. And you can kind of see already why I'm using the two jars. This one already has quite a bit of pigment in here. So if I were to use this water and say I would want to go and pick up the green, I'd be mixing that purple with the green. So I wouldn't be getting that pure color. Okay, and you can see again how that's kind of a more muted tone between these two. Okay, and now the green and the pink. And these two, so green and red or green and pink are opposites on the color wheel. So they're going to naturally cancel each other out. So you're going to get a very desaturated kind of gray color here. Again, depending on the ratio. So you can be more pink or can be more green depending on how much you use of each pigment. See, that's quite a grayed down kind of green, and I could add a little bit more pink to that and get more of like a true gray if I wanted to. Hopefully you can see those there. So once you've got a feel for your colors here, we're next going to practice a little bit of brush work. So the great thing about these round brushes is that they have this tip and then the bigger belly. So you can really utilize the shape of your brush to get different shapes on your paper. And you can vary the amount of pressure that you're using so that you're either using just the tip or you're using more of the belly. So I can show you what it looks like just to draw a very thin line, just using very little pressure and just the tip of the brush. And if you hold it down closer to the ferrule, almost like you're holding a pencil, that's going to give you more control than it would if you were holding it up here. So I'm going to hold it nice and close so I have more control. I'm going to apply very little pressure, just kind of barely touching the paper here, and that's going to give me a nice line. And the more pressure you apply, the thicker your line's going to be. And you can also, as you're going along the page, you can try it this way, try up and down, and you'll get different variations there. Now, as you're moving across the page, you can try adjusting your pressure. So I'm going to start off with very little pressure, and then I'm going to press down more as I move across the page. So very little, and then I'm pressing down more, and lifting off. So you can see where I've applied very little pressure, it's a nice thin line, and then it gets thicker as I apply more, and I'm using more of that belly of the brush. And so this is really helpful in creating different shapes. So here, very little pressure, more pressure, and little again. And that creates kind of like an oval shape there. Or you can start off with very heavy pressure and pull off. You can use that flat shape that you've just created by doing that to create whatever kind of shapes you want. So this is all about varying your pressure and utilizing the shape of your brush. So we can kind of create little leaf shapes here by using the shape of our brush. So light pressure, thick pressure, light again. So light, thick, heavy, light. Light, heavy, light. And don't be afraid to move your paper as you go, depending on what's more comfortable for your hand. So you can adjust it however you want, whatever works best for you. So just try kind of practicing using your brush. If you're finding that you're losing that tip, you can always just use your hand to sort of shape it back into place. Just kind of play around with it, really get a feel for the different shapes that you can use, how you can really kind of utilize the shape of the brush. So just take a few minutes and practice creating lines and shapes and varying the pressure that you apply. It'll just help you get a feel for what you can do with just this one brush. And we'll use some of those techniques and learn a little bit more about that as we go and work with our flowers more. We're gonna jump in and start painting our flowers. So the first thing we're going to learn how to paint is a very simple pansy. So we're not going for realism here. I want you to keep it very loose and just kind of more suggestive of a flower. Okay, so we're gonna first start off with just water. You can actually use your dirty water here if it's not super dirty, just to kind of help you see where you're laying down your water. We're gonna be working wet onto wet here. So you're first gonna start off with 3 kind of rounded triangles. Hopefully you can see that there. I'll try adding a little bit of pigment. Yeah. So just 3 triangles. So using the shape of your brush there, you want to use the tip and point that into the center and then press down to use that belly of the brush. So you're creating your shape there. And again, don't worry about making it perfect. You can move around your paper if you feel the need to. So just kind of rounded, kind of chubby little triangles there. And you can always fix them up as you go if you're not super happy with them right away. Okay, so hopefully you can kind of see those on the paper there. Now we're going to dip into whatever color you'd like. So throughout this whole painting you can use whatever color you want. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to pick up this purple here. And again, you can test out how strong that pigment is before applying it to your piece. And then just drop it right into the center, and that's gonna move and bleed out and sort of blend into that water that you already have down on the page. And if you want, you can take a clean brush and kind of move it around in that water and help it spread, or you can just let it do its thing. You can add more pigment if you want. This is kind of part of the beauty of watercolors, that you can use it like this and it will just do its own thing. And just make sure that you're leaving some white space in between those petals just to help keep them defined. Okay, now we're just gonna let that blend out and dry a little bit, and then we're gonna go in once it's dry and add in some more details. Okay, so while we're waiting for that to dry, I'm going to move on to the next flower. We're going to be doing, again, a very simple rose. So you're gonna start off with a fairly dark mix. So for your rose, you want the center to be darker, and then we're going to go lighter and bigger brush strokes as we move out from the center. So if you think of a rose or like a peony, the petals are always sort of compact in the center, and then you have the petals kind of layered on top of each other as they go out, and they kind of unfurl as they go out. So you're gonna first start with a fairly pigmented color, again, using whatever color you want. I'm gonna start with just the pure permanent rose here. And you're just gonna add just a few little dots there, just like that. Okay, and then using the very tip of your brush, you're going to create these little C curves. So again, you want it to be fairly close to the dots that you've already created, and with each curve you want them to be fairly close, but you still want to leave some white space so that you can kind of tell that there are different petals there, but they can overlap and touch. And don't worry about being perfect. It's okay if your lines are kind of broken up like that, or if they're touching or not touching, it's okay. You just want to keep them fairly thin at this point. So just going around, adding in those C curves wherever you see fit. And again, you can move your paper around if that's more comfortable for your hand. Okay, so once you're happy with that, then you're going to water down your pigment a little bit. So you want it to be lighter than what we just applied, but not too light that you can't really go any lighter, because our next stage is going to be a little bit lighter than this. Okay, and then you're just going to do the same sort of C-curved shape, so the same shape here, but you're going to go a little bit thicker, so you're going to apply a little bit more pressure to that tip of your brush. So the same thing, but you can see how that's a wider line. And it's kind of nice if you off-center the center of the flower. That sort of adds a little bit of dimension. It makes it look like it's kind of turning away from you a little bit. But you can do either way. If you want to keep it perfectly in the center, that's okay too. It'll look good either way. So just adding them wherever you'd like. There's no right or wrong here. And again, it's okay if they touch. You'll have the pigment sort of blending in as you go. Okay. And then again, you're just gonna water down that mix a little bit further so that it's even lighter. And then using even more pressure, so you're gonna create even bigger lines here. It might be a bit difficult to see, it's fairly light. So creating even thicker lines, you're going to continue doing the same thing, just moving out. And again, it's okay if these lines kind of meet up with the ones you had already, and if it's already wet, they're gonna blend into each other. That's totally okay. And just keep adding those until you're happy with it. And there you go, a very simple, easy but effective rose. And again, you can sort of change where you keep that center. If you sort of moved it over here, it would look like your rose is facing that way. If you had it smack dab in the center, then it would look like you're looking at it straight on. Okay, so our pansy is looking pretty dry here, and you can see how it's dried quite a bit lighter and it's spread out, and you have some really interesting textures going on there. See that? And you can tell that it's dry. So if you look at the rose here, there's a sheen to the paper when I move it, whereas with the pansy, it's looking pretty matte, so you know that it's dry. So we're just gonna take the same color that we just used, but we want it to be a little bit darker. And we're just gonna go in and add some details. So starting from the center of your flower, you're just going to kind of follow the shape of your petal and add some lines here. And you can sort of blend out the edges if you'd like. We're just kind of adding some extra detail and some extra visual interest here. So again, just starting in the center and pulling out, sort of following the shape of your petal. So as the petal's curving out here, you're sort of following that shape. And just using the tip of your brush, you can kind of bring it around if you'd like. You can close off the end. You can add a little bit of water to blend it out some more. And if you've laid down some pigment that you don't particularly like and you want to lift it back up, clean off your brush and then really dry it off on your paper towel here. And then using that dry brush, we call it a thirsty brush, you can go back in and pick up that pigment. So hopefully you can see that there. So what's happening is the dry brush is gonna absorb the water that's on the surface there, and with that water it's gonna pick up some of that pigment. And you'll notice me going back in and fixing the tip of the brush and just reshaping it as I go. Because when it's wet, the bristles might kind of spread out, so you can always just go back in and reshape it if you need to. So with this, you just want to keep the areas closer to the center darker, and you want the edges to be the lightest parts. You can also go into the center with a different color and just kind of drop in some little dots there, just to kind of hint at the center there and kind of add a little bit more visual interest. You can also add in some petals behind these petals if you'd like. So using the same technique, you just want to leave some white space between your new petals and the first ones that you've laid down. So again, just using the tip of the brush, I'm kind of getting in the way of that rose there. I'm just going to draw in little C curves, again following the edge of your initial petals, and then just create little C shapes to sort of just hint at those petals behind. And you can make those as big or as small as you'd like. And again, there's no like right or wrong really here. And there you go. So now it kind of looks like you have some petals behind there as well. But if you don't like the look of that, you can always skip it and just stick to the 3 petals there. It's completely up to you. Okay, so I'm just going to let these dry, and then we're going to flip onto the other side of the paper and do our final flower, and then we're going to practice some leaf shapes, and then we're going to move into a final design. Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to the 5-petal flower. So we're going to be aiming for this kind of shape here using, so each petal is going to be made up out of 2 brush strokes that will kind of look like these when we start. So this flower really utilizes the shape of the brush here. So you're going to, you can either pull up or pull down, whatever's more comfortable for you when you're creating your stroke. So to start off with, you're going to create 1 stroke, so starting with very light pressure and then pushing down and pulling up and lessening that stroke again. And you're going to make sure that when you're leaving the point in the center, that you're leaving a little bit of room between each brush stroke. So I'm just going to go back in and add to that the 2nd stroke, so it's going to kind of overlap this one. But again, you want to make sure that you're leaving that point there. Okay, so I'm going to go the other way, but again, you can go whichever way is more comfortable for you. So I'm going to start very light pressure, pulling up, applying more pressure, and then lifting up off. So you see how that creates that sort of petal shape. And it's okay if you have some pooling of your pigment. If it's not perfectly even, you can always go back in and kind of move that around if you want, or lift up some of the pigment if you want it to be a little bit more even. And then we're just going to do that exact same thing all around, so creating 5 petals. And again, don't forget that you can move your paper around so that you're getting a better angle for your hand, whatever's more comfortable for you. Okay, so I'm just going to do that all around here. And it's okay if the ends don't perfectly match up. If you have a little bit of a rough edge, that's okay. Again, it just kind of adds a little bit more visual interest. You don't want things to be perfect. Nothing in nature is perfect, right? So we're going for organic shapes here. And just make sure you're leaving some white space between each petal. And you can always go back in if you want to make 1 petal bigger, or if you want to slightly adjust the shape. You can always go back in and adjust it. Okay, so that's looking pretty good to me. I'm just gonna let that dry a little bit. If you want, you can actually, before it dries, go in with a slightly darker mix than what you started with, and just like we did with the pansy, you can drop it into the center and let it sort of bleed out and blend in with whatever you already have there. So that'll look a little bit better if you have a lighter pigment down first. So I'm just going to let that dry a little bit, and then we're going to go back in and add in some more detail. Okay, actually, while that's drying, we might as well go into our leaf shapes. So taking, again, whatever color, doesn't have to be green, but I'm going to dip into the Hooker's green. And I think I might mix it with a little bit of purple just to kind of mute it a little bit. I have some purple already on my palette. Okay, so very similar to what we just did, we're just going to use the shape of our brush to create those sort of oval shapes that leaves typically take. So going with very light pressure, using the tip of our brush, moving up, adding more pressure, and then lifting off and using that tip again. And you can do that backwards if that's more comfortable for you. So light pressure, heavy pressure, lifting up, and using that tip again. And you can also, just like we did with the petals, you can combine those shapes if you'd like. So doing the exact same thing, I'm gonna just go to the other side of this leaf. And there you go. So you have a little bit of a white highlight in the center. And again, you can always go back in and adjust things however you want. You might not want that pooling, so you can lift up some of that pigment or push it around. So there's a very basic leaf shape, and you can let that dry and go back in on the other side with a darker shade, and that'll kind of add a little bit of shadowing to your leaf. And you can add in veining as well, whatever you'd like. And a nice way to add filler to your composition sometimes is to use, aside from leaves, you can also use little twigs and like berries. Whatever sort of shapes you come up with, you can pretty much make into a leaf shape or any kind of filler. So if you want to create a little stick, we're going to use very little pressure. And it's just going to be basically a collection of lines. So as thin or thick as you want. You're just going to start, draw a line. It doesn't need to be perfect. It can be kind of dotted. It doesn't need to meet up all the time. And then just adding more lines wherever you'd like to create little branches. Again, just using very little pressure. The less pressure you use, the thinner your line's going to be, versus the more, obviously, the thicker the line's going to be. So just wherever you like. And you can make the base of your branch a little bit thicker if you like. They tend to naturally grow that way. And then just kind of pull it off so it's a little bit thinner at the tip. And then from your basic branch there, you can add on some leaves if you'd like. Or you can add on little berries or flowers. So you can create just kind of little round shapes for berries. And you can make those as big or as small as you want, so you can even do just like little dots like that. Or you can create kind of little flower shapes or like little different sort of shaped leaves. Do like little V's here. So that's just using the tip of the brush and then the belly of the brush to create kind of a sort of an oval, like a rounded edge here, and then doing the same thing, kind of meeting that, pulling those together. You can do 3 shapes, really whatever you want. Again, you can do just little dots. You can add in leaves. So that's an easy way to create filler. So whatever sort of variation and combos you come up with. So you can also do like, say, a thin line and then adding leaves to either side. So you can do thin leaves, again, with very little pressure. So long, kind of rounded thin leaves. You can do bigger leaves with that line in the center. You can do really rounded leaves. Just like that. If you're having a hard time using your brush just to create them, you can always outline your shape and then fill it in if that's easier for you. So See, just a simple leaf there. You can also go back into whatever shape you've created and add in some lines and some veining if you'd like. Just like that. You can add a shadow to one side. Like that. Just, again, like, play around. All you're really doing is using lines and kind of ovally shapes or random organic shapes. So you can even kind of do something like this and just vary you can keep it at the same angle. You can do the same thing but switch up the angle of your lines. Again, this is just using the tip of the brush here. So it's just lines and shapes. You can also use that wet on wet technique, just like we did with the pansy. So if I have a nice wet watery shape here, you can kind of see that there, hopefully. And then just go into whatever color you want to use and drop it in. And then that will blend out. And create some interesting looking leaves. See, it's really easy to create these kind of filler leaf shapes. And they really don't need to be perfect, because the main character of the story here is going to be your flowers. And these are just really fillers. So just play around, try to come up with your own shapes, try playing around with different colors. Super easy. Okay, this flower, the 5-petal flower here, is looking pretty dry. It's not perfectly dry, but that's okay. So I'm gonna go back in and add in some more details. So using slightly darker tone here, I'm just gonna add in some lines kind of to hint at some veining. So just kind of, again, following the shape of the petal here. And you can also go outside of the petal, kind of around, just like that, and that just sort of adds some more visual interest. You can kind of add some dots or whatever you'd like. I kind of like adding these lines. It kind of almost gives the flowers some extra, a sense of movement and some details. So this kind of makes it look like there's highlighting, which adds sort of a more like there's more veining in the flower than if we were just adding in these lines right to the petals themselves. It kind of looks like there's extra highlights and extra texture, if that makes sense. Can also go in with a different color, and just like we did with the pansy, can just add in some little dots here, and that might bleed into your petals, and that's okay. Just like that. Now we have a nice little 5-petal flower here. Okay, so now we have learned all of these different elements. We can move on to creating our final piece. So we're just going to be putting all of these different things together in a nice composition. So you can take these different elements and use them however you want. There's a million different things that you can do with this. I have a few samples of what I've done previously. So I've done this little heart that's filled with flowers and leaves that make up the shape of the heart. So all I did here was draw out my shape and then go in and add in my big elements, so the big flowers here, and then go around and add in the smaller little leaves and various other little elements like the berries, just to fill up the space. So it's a straightforward painting, but it looks really nice and cute. You can also just do kind of like a bouquet style of painting. So starting off again with your bigger elements, I find that's the easiest way of beginning. It kind of gives you an idea of your starting point. It gives you your main focus. So if you start with your big elements and then move out into your smaller little bits, I find that's a really easy way to do it. And you can always sketch out your piece ahead of time if you want to be a little bit more comfortable going into it. And then with this one, I taped out this white area just with, you can use washi tape or any, like a painter's tape or masking tape, whatever you want. You might just need to either apply your tape to like a pair of your pants or to the table and pull it off a few times just to release some of the adhesive so it's not too sticky when you're pulling it off. Or you can also use a blow dryer just to melt that adhesive a little bit when you're trying to pull it off so it's not tearing up your paper. But anyway, so I taped off this little box here, and then I just painted a bunch of flowers and leaves around it and then removed the tape, and you can add a little message. It's a really, again, sort of cute and effective, very simple little design there. Okay, for our design here, I think I'm just going to keep it simple and stick to just sort of the 3-flower bouquet here. So we're going to use all of the different elements that we learned today and just kind of combine them all together. So I'm going to start off with a rose in the center, and you can sketch this out ahead of time or you can just jump right in. It's up to you, whatever you're most comfortable with. And again, I do find it's easiest to start off with your largest elements and move out from there. So I'm going to start off with our rose and then our 3-leafed pansy. And then our 5-petaled flower here. Hopefully you can see my sketch there. So it's very loose, very rough. You can always adjust as you go. This is just meant to be more of a guide more than anything. And I'm just gonna jump right in. So I'm gonna start off with the rose here. It's my biggest element. So again, starting off with the darkest color. Just gonna add in some little dots here into the center, and then little C curved lines. And as I move further out, I'm gonna apply more pressure and I'm gonna lighten up my mix. And you can always go back into your flowers and add more detail later on if you're not 100% happy with them right off the bat. So the exact same thing we did before. Again, just not worrying too much about being perfect here. And letting those colors mix and flow into one another. Okay, so now I'm gonna move on to the 5-petal flower here, but I'm gonna leave this petal here that's touching the rose until last, just so that the rose there has a little bit of time to dry. And I'm going to take that pink and mix in a little bit of purple, so it's a little bit more of a pinky purple color. So it's not the exact same color as the rose. And again, just using that light pressure to harder pressure and then lifting off so that we're creating that shape, that sort of petal shape, and doing the exact same thing and letting those touch. And making sure to leave some of that white space and the white space between the tips there. I'm just keeping in mind where I have the other flowers and which flowers I want to overlap versus what I want to sit on top. So I want this pansy here to sit on top of this flower, so I'm going to just stop it where the petal of that pansy meets. Adding in some of those lines here. Now the rose is fairly dry there, so I can go back and add that 5th petal. And that petal's a little bit of a different shade than the others, so I'm just going to bring those in to that color into the other petals too, just so it looks a little bit more cohesive. Go. I think that looks pretty nice. And I might go back into that a little bit later and play around with it some more if I feel like it. Now we're just going to work on that pansy. I'm going to leave this petal to last, just so it doesn't bleed too much with that one. I'm just starting off with just water. And if they bleed together, it's okay. You can always go back in and kind of add in some little details that help separate it. And I'm just going to use the pure purple here and drop that into the center. And let it bleed out a bit. And I'll let that dry. So hopefully you can see where we're at right now. So we have those 3 flowers started. Okay, and while I'm waiting for those to dry, I'm going to work on some of the sort of filler elements. So some of the leaves and sticks and things that just kind of help fill up the composition here. So using just whatever sort of color feels right. You just want to make sure you're not using just like one color for all of it, otherwise it'll look a little bit boring. So I'm going to start off with this leaf here. I'm just going to turn my page so I'm not getting my hand and everything. And I'm going to start off with the middle stem using that very light pressure here. You want a little bit more green. And I'm going to kind of pull out that stem and then create a little leaf shape. And just do that again up the stem. I'm not really following my drawing here, I'm just kind of adjusting it as I go. And there you go, you have your first little set of leaves there. Now I'm just going to go around and continue adding leaves and twigs and whatever sort of filler I feel like all around the piece. So I'm just going to do that same thing here, maybe creating a little bit of a different leaf shape, so maybe a little bit thinner and longer. So I'm just going to continue adding in just different elements around here. I'm just switching up my colors and varying up the elements, so it doesn't all look like it's the same thing. And you're just trying to fill up the space here. So it's not like you have the 3 flowers and then a whole bunch of empty space. So it's all just about creating a nice composition. You want to vary up the size and shapes of your elements. So the more variation you have, the more sort of visual interest you have. If it's all like the same shape and the same color, your eye is kind of going to get bored, and it's going to be very easy and quick to get all of those visual elements in, if that makes sense, to read it. So you kind of want to create interest with different elements so that your eye is moving around the composition and taking in all the different elements and all the different information. So it's kind of maintaining that visual interest. You can see with my composition here, because I did this very quickly, it's kind of off-centered, so all the big, sort of the focal center of the composition is sort of off-centered, so I'm just kind of trying to balance it out by bringing these elements over to the side more, so there isn't all of this blank space on this side. So it's just creating a little bit more of a balance this way. Again, don't forget that you can move your paper around to make it a little bit easier for your hand. It also kind of gives you a different perspective on your composition. So if you see it from a different angle, you might notice different things, little areas that maybe you missed that you'd like to fill, or little changes that you might want to make with your sketch. And you can always overlap your shapes and create different layers. If you want to do that though, just make sure that your first, whatever you lay down first, is dry before you go and lay down something else. Otherwise it's just going to bleed in to the first layer, which might not be the look you're going for. And I'm doing this very quickly, so it might look a little bit more messy than I would if I was like really taking my time with it. So don't feel the need to rush. You can take your time. You can always step away for a little bit and come back to it later. You don't have to do it all in one go. You know, whatever works for you. Okay, now I'm pretty happy with all of those little filler elements. So I'm going to go back into my flowers and just add in some last little details wherever I want. I've with this rose, it kind of all looks like it dried down to one shade, so I'm just going to add a little bit more contrast in some areas by adding in some darker hues here and there. And you can kind of see how that just brings it alive again. You can also, with the rose, while you have some wet areas, you can drop in like a different color and let that sort of bleed in. And that, again, just adds a little bit more interest. As in nature, you know, roses often have different colors within the same petal. And you can always go back in and lift things out if you've gone a little overboard. Blend things together if you want. And then I'm just going to go into the 5 petal here and add in some darker colors and some veining, just like we did earlier. And I'm just going to do the exact same thing with the pansy. Just play around with it until you're happy with how it looks. And you have a couple of sheets of paper if you're working from the kit, so you can try out different things if you'd like. Okay, so for me, I think I'm going to leave that there. Just a pretty little floral bouquet. And again, you can try out different techniques and different compositions. Just use your imagination here. This one makes a really cute little postcard. If you're doing like a Valentine's night or something, this one's super cute. Okay, so I think I'm gonna end that there. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. I'd be happy to get back to you. And thank you. Thanks for painting along with me. I hope to see you with the next one. Thanks, guys. Bye.